carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and the corn.
The situation in Jamestown during 1609 to 1610 was horrific. Indeed, it was a real-life horror tale. But that wasn't the only situation taking place in conjunction with the Jamestown colony during that winter. There were still 150 shipwreck survivors in Bermuda. What were they doing during this time? Did they find that the mythical island was indeed an island full of devils? How did they cope with their shipwreck? Did they still want to finish the 700-mile trek to Virginia, or were they now content to establish a new colony and make a new living on the island? If they were to leave, how were they to sail to Virginia given that their 300-ton sea venture was too damaged to set sail ever again? Knowing what we know now, we can look back at the historical record and call the Sea Venture survivors first, extremely blessed, and second, unbelievably foolish. They were blessed in that they landed upon an island that no one wanted any part of. Because of that fact, the 150 survivors were essentially untouchable from Spanish harm. Regardless, George Somers thought it was wise to establish some sort of fortification and lookout in order to organize defense should the need arise. Thus, work was organized which would keep the angst-ridden survivors busy for at least the time being. Another reason why the survivors were blessed by landing upon a previously untouched island was that the vegetation and wildlife was well-stocked and unharmed to such an extent that animals did not cower when humans were present. This was certainly good news for those wondering how they'd obtain their next meal. Somers himself waded out into the surf in order to catch fish. He quickly found that Bermuda boasted many types of fish, and they were all in abundance. William Strachey said that Somers, and those who soon followed their captain, found it encouragingly easy to catch such a plentiful bounty that, in half an hour or so, many great fishes with hooks were caught, as did suffice the whole company. Apparently baskets of fish were easily caught, and the fish were so big that one fish would easily fill 2 men. Fish was not the only meat to be had on the island, however. Various shellfish, lobsters, oysters, crabs, and crayfish were also discovered. Still, in addition to being a seafood lover's paradise, Bermuda boasted various migratory birds, as well as the legendary native cahao, known today as the Bermuda petrel. It was the cahao whose frightening cry perpetuated the myth that Bermuda was full of devils. The bird is nocturnal, and at that time covered the island. That being the case, when night fell and the birds awoke, anyone who didn't know any better would be frightened into madness from the cacophonous, at times eerie, noise coming from the flocks of these birds. So great and trusting was the cahao population that a man could reach out and grab a bird when he wished. One survivor said that he could stand on a rock and make laughing and hollering noises that attracted flocks of cahaos to come land on his outstretched arms and head. Cahao eggs were also easy to obtain. Oddly, the survivors claimed that they would just take the eggs often with the parents present. No fuss or attack. Such an occurrence really illustrates just how free from human intervention Bermuda truly was. It also illustrates why so few of these birds are alive today. In addition to birds and fish, Bermuda was stocked with massive sea turtles who used the island as a nesting location. As with the cahaos, the sea turtles were also easily captured. But they did require a bit more manpower to carry. In some instances, 3 to 4 men were required to haul their capture back to camp. Once there, the turtle could feed up to 6 people for about a dozen meals. Plus, the turtles had one added delicacy that the fish and birds did not. An extremely sweet oil was obtained from inside each shell that was sweeter than butter. Finally, and perhaps most importantly as far as Virginia is concerned, Bermuda possessed hundreds of wild hogs. The hogs were apparently unloaded on the island by a passing Spanish ship in the 1500s. The Spanish reasoned that a time might come when a distressed ship might need to pull ashore or even be shipwrecked on the island. If that ever happened, the hogs would provide a ready food supply. So, in an odd twist, the Spanish, who were certainly frightened by the English presence in Virginia, inadvertently helped the struggling English colony to survive after the Sea Venture survivors finally did make it to Jamestown, bringing a few hogs with them from Bermuda in 1610. It was these hogs that would be used to feed the hunger-ravaged, starving time survivors. The hogs that the Spanish dropped off enjoyed a naturally predator-free existence on the island, which allowed them to multiply rapidly. By the time the English happened upon them, the hog population was reportedly in the hundreds. Eager colonists, much like Jack from The Lord of the Flies, hunted the animal, often capturing 40 to 50 at a time. Some of the hogs were immediately slaughtered for consumption, while others were domesticated for future use. Besides the abundant meat possibilities, the colonists could also feast on natural produce such as palm leaves and various berries found throughout the island. They could even flavor their meals with sea salt that they harvested by collecting water, boiling it, and then keeping the residue salt after the water had evaporated. In other words, Bermuda was the perfect place to start a colony. Virginia was not. While the survivors were enjoying temperate weather and bountiful provisions, the Jamestown settlers were starving to death. Those dying settlers even included most of those who initially disembarked with the Sea Venture in spring 1609. But the Sea Venture survivors did not sign on to start a new colony. They pledged to supply an existing one that apparently had great wealth-making potential. Therefore, Bermuda, as wonderful as it was, had to be abandoned. But not everybody wanted to leave. They had all that was needed and more. Besides, it seemed that God had brought them there. We should thank Him for that, as William Strachey did, and stay put. But men like Thomas Gates, who would be in charge upon arriving in Virginia, wanted to beat a hasty departure. He opened the Virginia Company's secret instructions to find out who was to make up the council. Once that information was obtained, Gates ordered those men that were on the Sea Venture to create work groups in order to devise a way to reach Jamestown. The first order of business Gates gave toward that end was for the Sea Venture's longboat to be prepared to endure the 700-mile trip to Virginia. He wanted to send men ahead of the remaining survivors. Those men would ensure the Jamestown colonists that those aboard the Sea Venture were still alive. After that was done, Jamestown was to send a ship to gather the survivors and bring them to Virginia. A well-seasoned sailor named Henry Ravens was tipped to lead the mission, and 8 others volunteered to join the ride. They waited to disembark only as long as it took George Somers to map the shoals around Bermuda, as well as receive final instructions from Thomas Gates about who was to temporarily govern Jamestown in Gates' absence. Gates had chosen Peter Wynne, but his choice was in defiance of the Virginia Company's directive. Somers was to be the next in command after Gates, then John Ratcliffe, and John Smith, and so on according to the company. Gates' action was certainly very unpopular. It furthered tension that existed before the 9-ship fleet left England. Somers, for one, was vocal about his annoyance. Thus, factions started to appear soon after they had all started working together to stay alive. Regardless, the longboat was supplied and set sail on August 28, 1609. However, 2 days later it returned. It seems the crew couldn't figure out how to exit Bermuda's dangerous coastal surroundings. But Henry Ravens promised to find his way out of Bermuda and then return with help before the next moon. In anticipation of help arriving during that time, Gates established signal fires along Bermuda's high points and set watches to look out for any arriving help. 1 month passed, then 2. Then all understood what had happened. Ravens and his men were never seen from again after they left Bermuda. The ever-widening factions that started in September 1609 began to seriously test Gates' leadership as a result. What was he to do? Gates was a military leader, so he did what came naturally. He dictatorially demanded obedience at the point of death. But that demand was not heeded. In fact, it only served to separate the men even more. Therefore, Gates now had to begin staring down a series of potentially violent mutinies.
To see where I belong now. Oh, I'm breaking down. I'm breaking
The initial rebellion arose when Gates ordered a veteran shipwright, Richard Frobisher, to organize a team and build another pinnace. Frobisher, along with 4 carpenters, began work by scouring the Sea Venture wreck and taking what they deemed useful, which included the damaged ship's keel. Gates, unlike the gentleman at Jamestown, jumped in to help. He felled trees, assisted in sizing the planks made from those trees, and did whatever the carpenters told him to do. He wanted the survivors to do as he did, not just as he said. Thus, his managerial style worked in that it did encourage others to work. But a few days after the project began, a religious dissension plagued the work. John Want, a separatist like the more famous Mayflower settlers a decade later, who followed the teachings of Robert Brown, rejected Gates' authority based upon principle. A little side note here about Robert Brown. Brown was a Cambridge-educated Anglican minister who was for reforming the Anglican Church. He became a Puritan, but decided that the Puritan movement was not biblical enough for true reform. Therefore, Brown and his following set up their own congregational meeting. Before long, Brown was summarily arrested for his beliefs, but was eventually released through a nepotistic network that involved his relative William Cecil. Upon acquittal, Brown and his congregation did not remain in England. They fled to Middelburg in the Netherlands in order to establish their meetings without fear of punishment. It wasn't long, however, before internal dissension ripped the community apart 2 years later. Brown returned to England and eventually distanced himself from his earlier movement. In fact, he returned to the Anglican Church and became a teacher within that model and was eventually buried within St. Giles Church graveyard at Northampton, England. Regardless of Brown's later-in-life stance, his ideas did take root as seen in the extremely well-known Plymouth Bay colony, but they were also alive on board the Sea Venture in 1609. John Want apparently had friends who also shared those Brownist ideals, and they were working with Gates on the new pinnace. One such person was the carpenter Nicholas Bennett. He and Want worked together to encourage 5 other men to stop working on the project based upon their Brownist beliefs. It seems that these men knew something about how Virginia truly was, not the Virginia of propaganda. They knew of a Virginia of starving, toil, and death, because as part of their message, they warned about that life in the distressed colony. They argued that they should all stay in Bermuda and live. Why leave paradise for hell? Their dissension spread, and eventually Gates caught wind of their plans to leave the colony in order to establish a separate settlement. Gates was not amused. Nor was he likely to tolerate such, in his mind, treason. He rounded up the suspects, put them on trial, found them all guilty, but didn't kill them, which was the usual punishment for mutiny. He instead let them do what they had wanted, establish a colony apart from the main body on a nearby separate island. But the chosen island did not have the comforts of the main settlement. The rebellious men held out as long as they could before starvation began to take a toll on their physical and mental state. Soon, the men gave in and begged Gates sorrowfully to forgive them and let them return to the colony. Gates eventually accepted their plea, and the men did return, but that did not mean that all the mutinies were squashed. By November 1609, just when the first deaths were occurring in Jamestown, the faction following George Somers started to complain about Richard Frobisher's pinnace. It seemed to them that the ship was too small to carry them all to Virginia. And indeed, the dissenters were right. It was too small. Gates hadn't intended to take all the settlers. He intended to take a few and then come back to gain the rest. From there, the complaint grew into conspiracy. Somers' faction then became concerned that Gates would leave with his followers and leave the rest of the settlers stranded on the island. Somers attempted to cut off a potentially more serious mutiny by asking Gates for 20 men and the necessary tools needed to build a second pinnace. Gates begrudgingly gave Somers the requested men and some mostly useless tools. It was a sort of half-hearted attempt at conciliation on Gates' part, but Somers made do with what he had, and thus for the time being everyone was happy. Sort of. Somers had to harvest more wood, as well as figure out a new way to seal gaps watertight in his ship, because of Gates keeping all the pitch, tar, and oakum. Somers' team was ingenious. They concocted a compound made from whelk shells that did the trick. Further, the cedar that they had harvested from Bermuda became watertight naturally after coming into contact with the sea. As the days moved on, work on both ships was coming along quite well. Gates' ship was aptly named Deliverance, and Summers, perhaps even more aptly, was named Patience. Yet before either ship was completed enough to put into the water, the survivors had to endure Bermuda's winter, which can be and did become quite blustery. One such January storm threatened to undo all of Gates' work on the Deliverance, but the men steadied their project just as windswelled surf threatened to take the ship away. Such dangers were ever present with storms, but these storms had another, more sinister effect. The colonists could not accomplish much work during the storm-plagued conditions that had set in. Thus, they went from busily working to idly abiding, and idleness certainly did become the devil's workshop on Devil's Isle. As a result, a new mutiny was underway when one Stephen Hopkins challenged Gates' authority. Hopkins was a well-respected assistant to Reverend Richard Buck, the colony's pastor. He theorized that Summers was the leader while they were on the ocean, and Gates' authority only kicked in when they landed in Virginia. Thus, Gates was not in charge as they had not yet reached Virginia, and Summers was also not in charge as they were not on the ocean. So who was to rule? Hopkins reasoned that the survivors were free to form their own government while they were on Bermuda. They could choose to follow Gates or Summers, but they were not compelled to do so. In fact, while they were alone on the island, they were only subject to the laws of nature, and Hopkins loved the island. But those who listened to Hopkins' theorizing began to fear. Gates was light on the first mutiny, and Summers' work stopped a second conflict. But would there be any mercy left for a third potential rebellion? Two of those listeners didn't want to wait to find out. Samuel Sharp and Humphrey Reed alerted Gates to what Hopkins was saying. Reed and Sharp were somewhat right to be afraid. Gates chained Hopkins, put him on trial, and condemned him to death. Hopkins, upon hearing his verdict, broke down in tears, begged for mercy, stating that his death would bring the ruin of his wife and children back home in England. Such was his cry that the castaways heard his plea and successfully took up his cause. They moved upon Gates, who seemed to believe that Hopkins truly was repentant, and he freed the guilty man. Hopkins, for his part, stopped playing the rebel and became a productive part of the venture, both in Bermuda and eventually Virginia. He, however, did not remain in Jamestown past 1614. While he was there, he received tragic word of his wife's 1613 death, returned home to his children, remarried, and came back to the New World, this time in 1620, aboard the Mayflower. He would become a vital member of the Plymouth Bay colony in large part because of his experiences with the Indians in Virginia. In fact, it was Hopkins' house that was used as the first meeting place between the Plymouth Bay colonists and the Wampanoag chieftain Massasoit. Still, that's not where Hopkins' legend ends. He is also believed to have been the inspiration for Stephano in William Shakespeare's The Tempest, which is also believed to have been loosely based upon the Sea Venture shipwreck. True or not, Hopkins being freed had lasting effects in more than just Bermuda, but Hopkins' rebellion was still not the last to plague the Sea Venture castaways. Full-time work eventually resumed on both the Patience and Deliverance in March 1610, as the starving time deaths were rapidly mounting in Jamestown. Both ships were progressing quite well when the most serious mutiny broke out. William Strachey claims that the life of Gates was in danger as new conspirators stole swords, axes, hatchets, and saws in order to be used to kill Gates. But a few men chickened out. Instead of murdering the governor, they exposed the plot to kill him. Gates warned the colonists that no one could be trusted. Every individual should arm himself and be on the lookout for devious actions being done by his neighbor. He also established watches as a precautionary measure. But those watches were not well received by all. On March 13, 1610, Henry Payne was stealing weapons when his turn to stand watch came. He was called to the watch by his superior, with whom Payne started to shout back and forth. The yelling soon turned to blows when Payne started beating the officer. He continued his vehement noise as he started to walk away from the post. Fellow guards tried to calm Payne down by talking reasonably to him, but nothing worked. He continued to reply with such cursing that Strachey was too ashamed to record it. Payne's actions wouldn't go unpunished this time. When word reached Gates, the governor quickly captured the irate thief, tried him, found him guilty, and set about to hang the man. Though Payne accepted his sentence, he requested that since he were a gentleman, he should be shot, not hung. Gates obliged, and Payne was shot by firing squad later that evening on March 14, 1610. Thankfully, at least it seemed so at the time, their troubles were soon ended. Both pinnaces were completed, and they were put into the water, and had begun to be loaded when the final mutiny took place. Men who sympathized with Payne revolted, fled into the woods demanding to be left alone on the island. They further asked for clothing and a year's provisions, but Gates and Summers both believed it their duty to take all of the survivors to Virginia. Thus, they attempted to round up all of the mutineers. They succeeded in capturing all but 2 men, Christopher Carter and Robert Waters. Carter and Waters had reason to fear justice being served to them upon their arrival at Jamestown. Carter was part of John Want's initial mutiny back in September 1609, and Waters murdered another castaway with a shovel just after their being shipwrecked. Both then had reason to fear justice. Both also did not evince warm feelings amongst the other colonists, so both were left on Bermuda after deliverance and patience set sail. Gates' final acts on Bermuda were first commissioning a memorial to commemorate the settlers having survived 10 months on Bermuda, and second, the ships being loaded with enough provisions to make the 700-mile journey. They then left their safe haven in May 1610. 2 weeks later, they realized that many of the mutineers were indeed right about the harrowing stories that they had heard. Jamestown was a rotting cauldron of death. But the 150 Sea Venture survivors had stared at and beaten death for the last 10 months. These were no lightweight settlers. In fact, this group would come to save the Virginia colony from complete collapse, and eventually ensure her success. As always, your continued support of this podcast is greatly appreciated. Please continue to spread the word and help this small colony to continue growing. Start by following us on your favorite podcast provider, like us on Facebook, and visit the website. Sharing this and other episodes is the best way to expand this community. If you would like to do more, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. Links can be found on the website, or one can visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod to see the choices and rewards listed. And please join us next time as we begin looking into how the Sea Venture survivors affected Jamestown and the starving time victims.
Mas tudo bate despedido dos embazes.